Act 1. Twilight of the Tsars. In the gilded palaces of Imperial Russia, under the glittering chandeliers and Fabergés, lived a family seemingly untouched by the harsh realities faced by their subjects. They were the Romanovs, rulers of a vast empire for over 300 years. At their head was Tsar Nicholas II, a man devoted to his family but ill-equipped for the seismic changes shaking his nation. Beside him was his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, deeply religious, fiercely protective of her family, and heavily influenced by the mystic Grigory Rasputin. Together, they presided over a world of unimaginable opulence, unaware that their reign and their lives were hurtling towards a brutal and bloody end. The heart of their world was their 5 children, the 4 grand duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and the youngest, Anastasia, and the long-awaited heir, the Tsarevich Alexei. Born in 1904, Anastasia was known as the mischievous one, the family clown, full of life, energy, and a rebellious spirit. She climbed trees, played pranks, and possessed a charm that could lighten even the formal atmosphere of the imperial court. Her younger brother, Alexei, was the center of the family's anxieties. He suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disease passed down through Alexandra's side of the family, which meant even a small cut or bruise could lead to uncontrollable bleeding. His fragility bound the family together in a tight, almost suffocating embrace, isolating them further from the outside world. But outside the palace walls, Russia was a cauldron of unrest. Decades of social inequality, crushing poverty, disastrous military defeats, particularly in the Russo-Japanese War and later World War I, and Nicholas's autocratic rule had fueled a revolutionary fire. The Tsar, insulated by his advisors and his belief in his divine right to rule, failed to grasp the depth of his people's suffering and anger. The infamous influence of Rasputin over the Tsarina further eroded public trust in the monarchy. In March 1917, the breaking point finally arrived. Amidst food riots and mass strikes in the capital city of Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, the army mutinied. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The imperial family was placed under house arrest, their opulent world replaced by the confines of their palace, guarded by revolutionary soldiers. Their initial captivity was relatively comfortable, but as the political situation deteriorated and the radical Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, gained power, the family's fate grew increasingly precarious. They were moved from palace to palace, each location more remote and less accommodating than the last. Their final journey took them deep into the heart of Russia, to the industrial city of Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. There, they were imprisoned in a large, requisition merchant's house, ominously renamed by the Bolsheviks as the House of Special Purpose, the Ipatov House. Guarded by zealous revolutionaries who despised everything they represented, the Romanovs spent their final 78 days in a state of isolation, uncertainty, and growing dread. Anastasia celebrated her 17th birthday in captivity, a bittersweet occasion under the constant watch of their jailers. The twilight of the Tsars was rapidly descending into an endless night. Act 2. The Cellar of Death. By July 1918, the Russian Civil War was raging. White army forces, loyal to the Tsar, were closing in on Ekaterinburg. For the Bolsheviks holding the imperial family, the situation was becoming desperate. The potential rescue of the Tsar and his family was unthinkable. Their very existence was a potent symbol for the counter-revolution. A final, drastic order came down from the Bolshevik leadership, likely approved by Lenin himself. The Romanov family was to be executed. In the dead of night, between the 16th and 17th of July, the family was awakened. They were told that the White Army was approaching the city and that, for their own safety, they needed to be moved to a secure location, possibly the basement. Unsuspecting, the family dressed quickly. Nicholas carried his frail son Alexei, who was suffering from a recent injury and couldn't walk. Alexandra followed, along with their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Accompanying them were 4 loyal retainers who had chosen to share their captivity: the family doctor, Eugene Botkin, the Tsarina's maid, Anna Demidova, the footman, Alexei Trupp, and the cook, Ivan Karadanov. 11 people in total descended the stairs into the small, semi-basement room. The room was bare, measuring roughly 16 by 19 feet. Chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The others stood, lined up against the wall, waiting for instructions. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the House of Special Purpose and the leader of the execution squad, entered the room with his men. He abruptly read out a prepared statement. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas, stunned, reportedly uttered, "What? What?" before Yurovsky immediately raised his pistol and shot the Tsar point blank. That single shot was the signal. The basement room erupted into a horrific cacophony of gunfire. The executioners, armed with a motley collection of pistols, fired wildly at the huddled family. The room filled with smoke, dust, and the screams of the dying. The scene was one of chaos and brutality. Alexandra died quickly from a bullet to the head. The initial volley killed Nicholas, Alexandra, Dr. Botkin, Trupp, and Karadanov. But the children, and the maid Anna Demidova, did not die instantly. The room was so filled with smoke that the gunmen could barely see their targets. And something else was happening, something unexpected. As the smoke cleared, the executioners were horrified to see some of the Grand Duchesses, including Anastasia, still alive, seemingly unharmed by the bullets. They later discovered why. Sewn into the bodices of the girls' corsets were diamonds and jewels, smuggled into captivity, which had acted as makeshift bulletproof vests, deflecting some of the shots. The maid, Demidova, had also survived the initial barrage, protected by a pillow filled with gems she clutched to her chest. What followed was even more gruesome. The executioners, their nerves frayed, moved in to finish the job. They used bayonets and the butts of their rifles. The Tsarevich Alexei, still moaning on the floor, was shot multiple times in the head by Yurovsky himself. The struggling Grand Duchesses were bayoneted mercilessly. It took over 20 agonizing minutes for all 11 victims to finally fall silent. The small basement room was a slaughterhouse, awash in blood. The Romanov dynasty had ended in a frenzy of brutal, close-quarters violence. Act 3. The birth of a myth. The execution itself was horrific, but the Bolsheviks' clumsy and secretive attempts to dispose of the bodies created a fog of confusion that would allow one of history's most enduring myths to take root. Immediately after the killings, Yurovsky and his men were faced with the gruesome task of removing 11 bodies from the basement and destroying them so completely that no trace would ever be found. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven out of Ekaterinburg under the cover of darkness, heading towards a remote, abandoned mine shaft called Gonina Yama. The initial plan was simple: dump the bodies into the mine. But the mine shaft proved too shallow. Realizing their mistake, the squad returned the next day with gasoline and sulfuric acid, intending to cremate the bodies. The process was a macabre and incompetent disaster. They attempted to burn the bodies, but the fire was not hot enough for complete cremation. Frustrated and under pressure, Yurovsky made a new decision. They retrieved the partially burned and dismembered remains from the shallow mine. According to Yurovsky's own secret report, they took 2 of the smaller bodies, believed to be Alexei and one of his sisters, and buried them separately in a nearby clearing, hoping to confuse anyone who might later discover the main grave. The remaining 9 bodies were then taken a short distance away and buried in a shallow pit beneath a dirt road, where they were doused with sulfuric acid to further disfigure them before the pit was filled in and concealed. The secrecy surrounding the disposal, combined with the Bolsheviks' initial vague and contradictory announcements about the family's fate, they initially only announced Nicholas's death, claiming the rest of the family was safe, created an atmosphere ripe for rumors. As the White Army captured Ekaterinburg shortly after the murders, they launched their own investigation, led by Nicholas Sokolov. Sokolov found evidence of the burning at Gonina Yama, bone fragments, corset stays, jewels, but he never found the main burial site. His conclusion, widely publicized in the West, was that the bodies had been completely destroyed by fire, leaving open the possibility that not everyone had been accounted for. It was in this fertile ground of confusion, secrecy, and wishful thinking that the Anastasia myth was born. Stories began to circulate almost immediately. Soldiers involved in the execution reportedly whispered that one of the daughters had survived. The detail about the jewels sewn into the corsets, potentially deflecting bullets, added a layer of plausibility. Anastasia, the youngest and most spirited of the Grand Duchesses, became the focus of these survival legends. People wanted to believe that at least one member of the tragic family had escaped the horror. Refugees fleeing the Russian Revolution spread these stories across Europe. The idea of a lost princess, robbed of her identity and fortune, wandering the world in secret, captured the romantic imagination of a public fascinated by royalty and tragedy. The stage was set for claimants to emerge, women who would step out of the shadows and declare themselves to be the surviving Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov. Act 4. The woman called Anastasia. Over the decades following the Romanov execution, dozens of women came forward claiming to be the surviving Grand Duchess Anastasia. Most were easily dismissed as frauds or mentally unstable individuals. But one claimant stood out, capturing the world's attention and convincing many, including former Romanov courtiers and even some relatives, that she was the real Anastasia. Her name, for most of her life, was Anna Anderson. Her story began in Berlin in 1920. A young, distraught woman was pulled from the Landwehr Canal after attempting suicide. She carried no identification and refused to speak. She was committed to a mental asylum, listed only as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. After months of silence, whispers began to circulate among the staff and patients that she bore a striking resemblance to the famously beautiful Grand Duchess Tatiana, Anastasia's older sister. When confronted with this, the woman reportedly became agitated and eventually confessed, not that she was Tatiana, but the youngest daughter, Anastasia. Thus began the decades-long saga of Anna Anderson. Her story was compelling. She claimed that she had survived the execution, shielded by her sisters and the jewels sewn into her clothes. She alleged that a sympathetic soldier named Alexander Tchaikovsky had rescued her from the basement, nursed her back to health, and helped her escape Russia. She bore numerous scars, which she claimed were from the bayonet wounds inflicted by the Bolsheviks. Her knowledge of intimate details about the imperial family's life was uncanny. She seemed to recognize former members of the court, recall private family anecdotes, and possess knowledge that, supporters argued, only the real Anastasia could possibly know. She was visited by former Romanov relatives and retainers. Some, like Tatiana Melnik, daughter of the murdered Dr. Botkin and Gleb Botkin, Dr. Botkin's son, who became her lifelong champion, were utterly convinced of her authenticity. Others, like Anastasia's grandmother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, and the Tsar's sister, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, met with her but ultimately rejected her claim, finding inconsistencies in her story and her physical appearance. Anna Anderson's personality was complex and difficult. She was often described as arrogant, moody, and prone to dramatic outbursts. Yet, this very temperament was seen by her supporters as evidence of her royal upbringing, the behavior of a traumatized princess forced to live among commoners. Her case became a legal battleground. For decades, she fought in German courts to be legally recognized as Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov and to gain access to the alleged Romanov fortune held in foreign banks. The legal battles were protracted, spanning from the 1930s to the 1970s, and became one of the longest-running lawsuits in German history. Ultimately, the courts ruled against her, stating that while her identity as Anastasia could not be disproven, it had also not been sufficiently proven. Despite the legal setbacks, Anna Anderson lived her life as Anastasia. She married a wealthy American history professor, Jack Manahan, and moved to the United States, living in Charlottesville, Virginia. She remained a figure of public fascination, the subject of books, plays, and famously, the 1956 Hollywood film Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman, though the film took significant liberties with her story. For millions around the world, Anna Anderson was Anastasia, the lost princess who had miraculously survived. But the definitive answer to her identity would have to wait for the advent of a technology she could never have imagined: DNA testing. Act 5. Science solves the Romanov riddle. For over 70 years, the fate of the Romanovs remained shrouded in mystery and speculation, fueled by the compelling story of Anna Anderson and the absence of the bodies. Then, in 1991, the shroud began to lift. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, two amateur Russian historians, acting on suppressed local knowledge and Yakov Yurovsky's secret report, rediscovered the hidden grave near Ekaterinburg. In a shallow pit beneath a dirt road, they unearthed the skeletal remains of 9 individuals. Forensic analysis confirmed the scene was consistent with the execution. Bullets, bayonet marks, and acid damage were evident. The international scientific community became involved. In a groundbreaking effort, DNA testing was employed to determine the identities of the remains. Scientists obtained DNA samples from the skeletons and compared them to living relatives of the Romanovs, most notably Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose maternal grandmother was Tsarina Alexandra's sister. The results, published in 1994, were conclusive. The DNA profiles matched. The grave contained the remains of Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, and either Maria or Anastasia. The remains of the 4 retainers were also identified. The science was undeniable. The core members of the imperial family had indeed been executed and buried in that pit. However, the discovery also confirmed a long-standing suspicion. 2 bodies were missing from the main grave. The remains of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of the Grand Duchesses, either Maria or Anastasia, were not accounted for. This tantalizing gap immediately reignited the Anastasia survival myth. Could Anna Anderson have been telling the truth after all? If one daughter was missing, perhaps it was Anastasia, and perhaps she had escaped. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in the summer of 2007. Guided by Yurovsky's report and modern archaeological techniques, a search team discovered a second, smaller burial site just 70 meters from the main grave. This site contained the fragmented and burned skeletal remains of 2 young individuals, consistent with the ages of Alexei and one of his sisters. Once again, advanced DNA testing was employed. Mitochondrial DNA from the new remains was compared to the established Romanov profile and to living relatives. The results, announced in 2008, were definitive. The second grave contained the remains of Tsarevich Alexei and his remaining sister. Further analysis strongly suggested the sister was Maria, based on skeletal development, though distinguishing absolutely between Maria and Anastasia based solely on these fragments remains challenging for some researchers. However, the genetic evidence was clear. All 5 of the Tsars' children were now accounted for. No one had escaped the Ipatov house basement. The scientific evidence had closed the book on the possibility of Anastasia's survival. And what of Anna Anderson, the woman who had embodied the Anastasia myth for over 60 years? She had died in 1984. Fortunately, a tissue sample had been preserved from a medical procedure years earlier. DNA testing was performed on this sample and compared to the Romanov maternal line. The results were unequivocal. Anna Anderson's DNA did not match the Romanovs in any way. Further comparison revealed a perfect match to Karl Macher, the great-nephew of a missing Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. Anna Anderson was not the lost Grand Duchess. She was, as her detractors had long claimed, Franciszka Szankowska, a woman with her own history of mental illness and trauma. Science had finally solved the Romanov riddle. The execution was total. The survival myth, fueled by decades of hope, confusion, and one woman's incredibly convincing performance, was definitively debunked. Yet, the legend of Anastasia endures. The story of the lost princess, the romantic tragedy, and the tantalizing what-if continues to capture the imagination, immortalized in films, ballets, and books. It is a testament to the power of myth and our enduring fascination with the ghosts of history.